Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Governance Made Easy webinar titled today, Exposing the Risk of Organisational Culture, with our special guest, Georgia Henry, CEO of Henry Reid, and BoardPro's own Chief People Officer, Chris Regan. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 45 odd minutes. Firstly, though, thank you for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here for our live event. During the session, if you have any questions for either Georgia or Chris, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or at the top, wherever your toolbar is. We'll be answering these during our session and try to get through as many of them as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those that don't know a great deal about BoardPro, we are a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, that serve around 20,000 users around the world, and I think we're across about 26 different countries at the moment. We enable organisations to prepare for and run their board meetings more efficiently and effectively with, you guessed it, clever software, with less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organisation. And as much as we are a software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organisations, especially those with resource constraints. And how we do this is through the production of these webinars, along with the many guides, templates, and white papers on our website. You will find all of this content, which is free to download, on our website, governance templates, white papers, in the resource center, which is boardpro.com/resource-center. Now, speaking of resources, for the next 40 odd minutes, just relax, listen, and add to the discussion by asking questions. A full recording of the webinar, along with the slide deck and this really great topic white paper from Georgia Henry, will be sent to you 24 hours after our webinar today. Let me now introduce our panel for you. Georgia Henry is the founder and CEO of Henry Reid, a specialist culture and leadership advisory business that supports boards, CEOs, executives, and business owners to optimize their organization's effectiveness through their people and drive positive change for meaningful and measurable impact. Georgia draws on her 30 years experience supporting organizations to navigate the complexity of cultural impact, leadership and employee behaviors, compliance issues, resistance to change, M&A integrations, and changing social expectations. Welcome again to you, Georgia.
Thanks, Sean. Really pleased to be here.
Chris Regan is a very experienced CPO, Chief People Officer, with over a decade of experience in rapidly scaling technology companies such as Xero, where she was the first HR director for Australia. Chris has built people functions from the ground up, supporting the journey from startup to scaling businesses while maintaining culture and engagement. She's really passionate about creating great places to work and helping early stage growing businesses to build people functions for real scale. This is your first webinar with us, Chris, so welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I shall hand over to the lovely Georgia Henry, who will get us kicked off for the afternoon.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. And I'm really thrilled to have Chris joining us. It's the discussion today is going to be added to by Chris's experience from that operational and entrepreneurial side, and looking certainly in that startup and scale up perspectives. My background is in a lot of larger organisations, and particularly now in the last 7 years, looking at from a culture from a board and an executive level. So really looking forward to unpacking this a little bit. And Chris, I challenge you to ask questions, challenge my thinking as we go through, and I really encourage everyone to ask questions as well, so the discussion becomes really relevant. So today we're talking about the risks of culture, but on the flip side of risk is always opportunity. So I've highlighted today, we're going to talk about 5 core risks that happen when you're looking at culture from a board perspective, and what you can do about it. So the risk number one that I've highlighted here is that you actually don't understand what culture really is. So most times when I start talking to boards about organisation culture, I get a variety of reactions. Some of those are the eye rolls, and the culture, it's that soft and fluffy stuff. And we actually don't have time for culture because we're too busy looking at the financial or the risk or the sustainability of the organisation. So the first risk from a board level in particular is not understanding what culture is. It is about the collective ways of working and interacting with each other. It's about behaviours, decisions, actions, and the impact that you have to be able to achieve your financial and non-financial results and create a competitive advantage, both as an employer and as a provider of products or services in a market, and your ability to focus on compliance and mitigate risk. So first big misunderstanding is that culture is around employee engagement or employee satisfaction. For me, engagement or satisfaction is a bit of a happy test at a point in time if you're relying on engagement surveys to understand your culture. Many of the boards or organisations that I've worked with can have highly engaged employees who have a real disconnect to the organisation, and the culture doesn't support the achievement of outcomes. Chris, what's your experience looking at engagement and satisfaction, as indicators of culture?
Wow, what a really interesting way to start off this discussion, Georgia, because you and I have only had a little bit of time together so far, and we haven't touched on this. So my experience in growing businesses, in particular in technology, is that engagement often is a lead indicator of how the culture is doing. So I appreciate we come from different angles and you're focused on the bigger companies and often your experience is influencing the board. But I do feel that they are linked in my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that they're linked, but it is not the only indicator. And I think one of the big risks is that organisations rely strongly on single indicators to give them an understanding of what their culture is, and that's actually not what it's all about. Sean, we might move on to the next slide, which is risk number 2. Which is, for me, thinking that culture is as it appears to be on the surface. And this is a huge risk, and I hear it quite often when I talk to boards or hear it in different presentations, that you can understand the culture of the organisation by walking around. You can get a real sense for what's happening. It's a bit like the iceberg. You can certainly get a sense of what's happening, but there's so much that's hidden, and not everything is always as it appears. So things that we can see by walking around are things like the culture artifacts, vision statements, values. We can see the overt behaviours. So what are people doing that we can actually observe? The type of language that's being used, policies, work practices, looking at the structure, the leadership style. So a lot of those things are the overt indicators of organisational culture. But there's so much that for me is hidden, and particularly from a board level, it can be really challenging to understand the culture of an organisation when you walk in to get a sense of culture, and things may not be as they appear. So generally, the strong indicators of organisation culture come through the emotions that people experience, bias and assumptions that may exist in the way that we make decisions or in the way that we interact with others, legacy thinking, legacy issues, unwritten ground rules. That's the way that we do it around here. A lot of those things, as well as misalignment, actually has such a significant influence on culture. And so the risk is, if we think about it we can get a sense of culture, we actually don't deeply understand it. And part of the risk of that is that we may not be understanding where fractures in the culture actually exist because things are glossed over, where there might be silos or cliques or poor behaviours being fostered within the organisation. So there's some real opportunities when we look at how do we understand what culture is. Chris, you're nodding along. What are your thoughts on this around how do you actually get an understanding of culture in an organisation?
I love this, Georgia, and I'm nodding along because I fully agree. I think this links to the first point, though, for me, and I'm interested in your views, that I think good engagement surveys that allow for anonymity will actually test some of this hidden behaviour. Have you experienced that in your career?
Yeah, so what we do when we assess organisation culture as an independent organisation, we do a culture survey, and it's probably deeper than an engagement survey. So we are asking a lot of questions around how do people describe the culture, as well as looking at some of those things that may exist under the surface. But we also ask a lot about emotions. So how do you feel at work? What are the most significant positive and negative emotions? Because that can give a really clear indicator, because emotions impact the way we make decisions, the way we behave, the way we interact with people. And if there's any negative emotions, it means that there can be a significant breakdown of trust, and really challenge the way that you can be effective in the organisation. So what I've also found is organisations that have high engagement scores, when there's not been the ability to understand a lot of these other hidden issues, there can be that low association with the organisation, as I said, and potentially some change resistance. And so the real opportunity is to look at how do we deeply understand not just scores in a survey or ratings, but deeply understand the stories and the emotions and the impact of people's experience. So we use a variety of methods. We do survey, but we also do interviews and focus groups, so we can really hear those personal stories and understand the impact that culture and ways of working has on people.
That's awesome.
I have a question, ladies, I have two questions now, from Eleanor. Hi, team. I'm interested to hear your views on how one might shift culture and attitudes of employees in the workplace. As someone who doesn't work in the HR space but has significant engagement with teams and business functions, I'm always looking at ways to improve my engagement with others in the business while driving key workflows.
Fantastic. We might flick on to the next slide. Great question, great lead into the Henry Reid approach to looking at organisational culture, which is really around organisational effectiveness. And I call this model a model of organisational effectiveness, particularly because of the responses I got when I was talking about culture, about it being soft and fluffy. This really shows the level of alignment between what you do from a board level through the organisation and the impact that it has on our ways of working, which is culture, and why it's really important. So understanding, to be able to improve culture, you've really got to understand, first of all, what is the current culture and what do we want it to be? What is it that we desire it to be? So every organisation has a culture, whether it's been created by default or created by design. So the centre of the model there is around identity. And identity is, who are we as an organisation? Why do we exist? What's most important to us? How should we be working to achieve our culture impact, which is that outside the circle? So having clarity of your purpose, your vision and your values, making sure that those then are aligned and embedded in your frameworks for governance, strategy and risk, so that those frameworks which provide you the appropriate boundaries and guidance for ways of working, for decision making, for reporting, for monitoring, for managing risks, that those things actually align to the type of organisation that you want it to have. So if they're not aligned, there can be a huge risk that people will behave in a way that's actually not going to focus on achieving results. So an example is, if we have an identity, we say that we're an organisation that wants to be very innovative and creative, and yet we have a 10-step authorization process to order a packet of biscuits. You're never going to be innovative. You've got to align those frameworks. And then it comes down to leadership. So how, as leaders, leading ourselves, our own behaviours, leading others and leading the organisation, are you actually role modelling the values, upholding the standards, reinforcing what's most important to the organisation? So for the question of how do you improve culture, it is around having the conversations, bringing the language of the culture of your organisation, of the values, into conversations that you have. Celebrate successes on that basis, call out behaviours or things that aren't aligned. And when those things happen, it creates the experience, a positive experience for employees, customers and other stakeholders. Or when they're misaligned, it can create a very, very negative experience. And it is the experience that we have, that we create for our employees, that influences our customers, that influences our ability to achieve results and manage risks. So, Chris, I know you've only been introduced to my model fairly recently this week. What are your thoughts on that? Because it's a view where I say that there's this real need for alignment of these things to actually optimise culture and our ways of working.
So I love your model, and I think I've had a little bit of time to reflect on it. I think my experience is parallel but slightly different in practice, because I'm in those growing business environments that often don't have a lot of infrastructure, or often don't have people with my skill set, for example, to help them develop really strong value propositions, for example, integrate those into performance reviews and, ways of working, as we talk about. So I think in the smaller businesses, my experience is that the leadership is so critical in creating the culture. Whether it's formal or informal, it starts at the top in those organisations. And I've been reflecting on your model since you introduced it to me, and I think we are aligned in that. Culture does start at the top. I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you're targeting the board to help own some of this, so that we have the freedom and support to create the right structures to influence positively our culture in the organisation. So it's a strategic goal rather than something that's an oversight for the board.
Absolutely. And if there's a real risk, if the board is not owning culture, then that consideration about the impact on people and how to optimise the execution of strategy, the governance and risk frameworks that support achievement of strategy and then enable leaders. If there's misalignment for that, it can be making it really challenging culturally for our to have effective ways of working. And I agree 100% that leaders, and for me, leaders have the greatest influence on culture in the organisation. So that middle ring of leadership, when we look at how do we lead ourselves, how do we lead others, and how do we lead the organisation, I think if everyone thinks back on their own lived experiences, you can recognise when you've worked for a good leader and have been very aligned, and when there's been a culture created because the activities, the systems, the processes, the structure of the organisation worked well to support outcomes, and you had a leader who upheld those things. The experience and the culture becomes quite very positive and enabling. And I think through lived experiences, we can probably similarly all recognise when we have worked for a leader that has not been so great, and the impact that has on our experience. And when our experience is negative, and that's the culture that's created, it makes it really challenging to work at our best. So Sorry, Sean.
Sorry to interrupt. We've got a few questions that have come in. Is it okay if we get to those now?
Absolutely.
Michael's asking, how do you test for underlying assumptions and implicit beliefs, such as fixed versus growth mindset, and what other implicit beliefs do you look at?
Great question. So, beliefs is something we work with boards and executive teams to understand and establish when we're designing culture. So at that identity stage, when we're redesigning culture, what are those core things that we fundamentally believe? Because they should always be core to every decision. If you're making decisions that are outlined outside of the beliefs, then that's a real challenge. The way that you then embed that in the organisation is through the reinforcement of the ways of working in the conversations. How to check, I think part of the question was how to check for underlying assumptions as well. So when we do an independent review of culture, we ask a lot of questions, and we try and uncover that by looking at not only those frameworks, the documents that exist, but what is actually happening in reality in leadership behaviours and employee behaviours that are actually not aligned, or show that there may be a disconnect to the beliefs of the organisation, but also the ways of working. And then through the interviews and focus groups, we really question around where is the evidence? So where is the evidence? What's being seen? What's being actually brought to life through the organisation? So testing for beliefs and assumptions. First of all, as with anything, you need to know what the core beliefs are of the organisation. Sometimes that's not clear. And then you need to look for the evidence of what's happening, and you get that through conversations and interviews and asking questions. Chris, do you have something to add to that?
No, I agree with everything you're saying. I think for anyone that's anyone that's on the call that's in a smaller business and may not have access to budget and structures and all of those wonderful things that we're talking about, sometimes it's as simple as how you implement your values, from my experience, and how you make sure that they're living, breathing entities that you call out in your ways of working every day if any behaviours are inconsistent with the values. So nothing to add, but just a slight sort of sideline that I've seen works well.
Yeah, and one of the greatest risks in this area is when we're talking about how do we bring values to life, is when you have a high performer who is behaving badly, and there's a perceived risk of, if we manage that employee or that leader's behaviour, there's going to be negative detriment to the organisation, because we have a high performer. We need that high performer, whether it's a sales performer or it's a sports person, or it's someone who's highly representative of your organisation. The big risk of not managing those behaviours and ensuring behaviours are aligned to the values is that you dilute the effectiveness and the importance of those values for everyone else, create double standards, and you create a culture where the rules don't always apply. And so it deteriorates trust very, very quickly. And you can bet that that's having a negative impact on the employee's experience, and will lead to employee turnover.
I couldn't agree with you more, Georgia.
Yeah.
I'm really passionate about this. So the best leaders that I've worked with adopt what they do and how they do it equally weighted in terms of performance. And I really believe in that, because how they go about it is so critical the whole organisation, right? Yeah. So I always challenge my senior leaders to make the tough call, the brave call in that situation, because it will have a ripple effect throughout the organisation. It also sets the tone for what we're willing to tolerate, and it supports employees who are behaving well and representing our culture, but also performing. They feel reassured. So absolutely. I agree.
And having that balance of, I call it the quantity and quality balance. It's the outcomes and the behaviours always need to be balanced. and knowing what those behaviours are. So this is where we talk about the alignment here. If we've created an identity and we've got values driving our behaviours and we've got a vision that's driving our strategy, for personal or individual performance, the strategy should be driving your KPIs, so helping understand what those outcomes are, but the behaviours coming from the values should be that balance. Now, where that's supported by your governance and risk frameworks, in your governance, in the ways of doing things, it's where you embed it in your processes. So as you said, Chris, in those performance reviews, in our policies, in the ways that we address performance issues, those things need to be, and our expectations need to be embedded to provide leaders with the opportunity to be able to manage those behaviours effectively.
We have a few other questions here, if we can fly through these quickly.
Yep, absolutely.
Helena, this one's for Chris. So my question to Chris is, what would be the appropriate time to start designing the vision, purpose, and value proposition for a technology startup company?
Wow, that's a really great question. So I've been with the wonderful team at Board Pro since March, and we're a team of around 30 at the moment, scaling, just to give you an idea. And I've worked in a whole combination of different size and scale pace companies. But at this level, if we don't have a good strategy and operation plan, it doesn't have to be, you know, as comprehensive as an ASX listed company for those in Australia, but it needs to be enough so that we understand what our purpose, vision, mission, you know, strategy is. It's really hard to align the things that George is talking about. So I would really encourage, there's some amazing information actually available on the Board Pro education portal, and Sean can probably point you to that, in terms of some base documents that help you create that strategy process if you're not already in it. I hope that answers the question.
And I'd just like to add too, on the you know, when do you create that purpose, vision, values? It should be at the very start of creating an organisation, a business, because if you don't understand why you're in business, so why are we here? What is the impact that we want to have in the world? What is the difference this organisation is going to make? What is our future aspiration for the impact of our work? And what do we believe as far as the you know, what's most important to us in our ways of working? If you don't understand that, you cannot create a really aligned and effective organisation. And I would challenge that it's going to be very difficult to recruit people who believe what you believe in, who are going to be aligned. You know, and when we get that right, and we can actually bring in people who are aligned to our identity and our purpose, vision, and values, what you create is an environment where there's a greater opportunity for discretionary effort, for innovation, for commitment to customer experience. So it actually has a really big flow-on effect. So I'd be saying start it early. Sean,
yeah. Sorry, Georgia, just to quickly finish up, I agree with you fully. In practice, sometimes these founders are chasing other priorities early on. So what I'd encourage everyone to remember is it's never too late, though. Yeah. You know, ideally start early, but you can start it at any time. All right. Thank you.
Agree. And I work with many large organisations when we do redesign, because it's either being a culture that's created by default and we need to recreate it. So yes, there's ideal, and then there's the reality of what can you do.
This one's from Rachel. Should the same strategy and methods be used to align, communicate, and reinforce in a hybrid work setting?
So the strategies have to be fit for purpose. So, and it has to be what works for your organisation. So I would challenge that it's not always going to be the same strategies, whether you're hybrid, whether you've got a geographically dispersed workforce, whether you're all in one office. I think it really does depend on what works for your employee cohort. Sometimes that is a little bit of trial and error. Communication is one of the biggest challenges faced in every organisation that I've worked with, and particularly around culture. Are we communicating too much, not enough? What methods? Do we SMS? Do we email? Do we put stuff on pay slips? Do we, it's a big challenge. So I would say the strategies need to be what works for you. What we saw during COVID is that employee satisfaction around levels of communication from their employers went up significantly because there was a lot of communication and there was a lot of care and empathy demonstrated in the communication. So I think rather than just looking at the strategy, it's around the messaging, the way the communication is framed. Keeping the objective of why you're communicating in mind is really essential. But I think it's very much a bit of a trial and error and what works for your organisation, because it is a challenge for every organisation.
Let's so we have a few more, but let's move on a couple of slides and come back to those questions, sure, ladies.
So if we jump onto the next slide, it is around the delegation of ownership of culture. And Chris and I had an interesting conversation about this earlier in the week. So from my perspective, and I agree, Chris and I agreed very much that culture is actually owned by everyone, or it's influenced by every person's behaviours. But for me, the ownership of culture needs to be from a board level. And if it's not, it creates a whole lot of risk within the organisation. So in 2020, I did a culture research study based on looking at ownership of culture and the level of risk. And what it actually showed is that organisations, based on where the ownership and decision making for culture sat within the organisation, it influenced the focus of risk. So when culture was owned by the board focus for culture and looking at the risks and opportunities of culture was very much around the organisation's sustainability and financial outcomes. When the board didn't own it but delegated that down to the CEO, the risk focus for culture was around financial outcomes and reputation. And when it was delegated to the accountability or the ownership of an HR function or a chief people officer, the risk focus was on employee retention and satisfaction. And so as a board, if you delegate the ownership of culture and don't own it, then you are actually changing the focus of risk from employee behaviours. And as far as I'm concerned, nothing happens in an organisation without people. And so the only way you achieve things in an organisation is through people. And so understanding and owning the culture of the organisation, making sure it's consistent and aligned, and that you have the governance, strategy and risk frameworks to support that culture, making sure you own that from the board level and role model it in the boardroom, in all interactions with executives, is the way to really strengthen it and make sure that it's going to be effective. So, Chris, I've jumped in and spoken a whole lot on that one. I know you've got some good thoughts on this as well.
No, I love it. Look, I think we're actually very aligned. I think what you've had the opportunity to do is work at the board level and influence some of this ownership. What I've had the responsibility of is trying to influence the ownership through the CEO, founder, or the leadership team. And I think what I'm violently opposed to is HR being people and culture, because we end up being assigned responsibility for culture. And that's where I feel everyone owns culture in the organisation, including the board in terms of leadership behaviours. And where that comes into practice for me in a smaller organisation or a scaling organisation is if the board don't take accountability for the inconsistent behaviours at CEO level, because that's where it starts for me.
Absolutely. And when I work with organisations, if I'm asked to come into an organisation and I'm not engaged by the board, it's almost impossible to be able to get culture outcomes and shift culture, because it is around behaviours, and there can be a lot of sensitivity about behaviours that happened on a CEO's watch or with particular executives. And it can be, also we need a board commitment to change, because culture change often is is around business transformation change, and there needs to be a commitment from a board level, because it's not about employee engagement, it's not about happy employees, it's around having a really effective organisation that's going to achieve your outcomes. Sean, we might flick onto the next one, conscious of time there as well. Risk number 5 that I've identified, and this is particularly by board level, is not asking for evidence. So information going to a board is filtered. It has to be. You can't understand everything. But sometimes information around culture gets filtered to the point where you don't have an understanding or clear line of sight of the behaviours and risks, particularly some of those hidden ones that are happening within the organisation. So information that should make a board sit up and pay attention is around complaints, looking at shifts in business metrics. So understanding, having a culture lens when you're looking at data, asking for stories and anecdotes, asking questions, looking at things like non-reportable incidents, not just reportable incidents that might get reported to a board, asking to sample exit interview data. So there's a whole lot of things there that you can ask for evidence. So particularly if you're finding that there's been an impact on that culture, then that culture impact area, like high levels of risk or complaints or inability to achieve results, you need to have a culture lens. What is happening that is impacting people's decision-making, people's way of working and their effectiveness? What do we need to know and understand? Sometimes the only way you're going to get that is through an independent review of culture, because in an environment where there might be some negative emotions, people won't actually raise issues openly, and so it can hide issues there. So asking for evidence at a board level is really important. Some of the metrics I had on the page before too, I quite often get asked about how do you measure culture, because I don't believe in engagement scores as a measure of culture. For me, it's how effectively is the organisation achieving outcomes and managing risk. That's the best indication of culture, and that differs for each organisation. Chris, what are your thoughts on what gets fed upwards to the board as well?
Look, I think it's a mixed bag, having worked for listed companies and smaller companies in the last decade. What I would say is that the board definitely pays attention to engagement scores now.
Yeah.
And what I've witnessed in my time is that the good engagement scores do actually test for well-being, including mental well-being and physical well-being, stress, all of those things. And if they are a really well-rounded tool, they will provide for anonymous feedback, which then can't be ignored. So it's a tool for someone like me to actually get attention if I need to, if I don't have that stakeholder buy-in already. Does that make sense?
Fantastic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just summing up, to shift the risks of culture into reward, really look at taking ownership of culture from the boardroom, reviewing how culture is defined by your organisation, or is it just been grown by default, understanding whether what you want the culture to be, whether that's actually how the culture is in the organisation, being able to then identify what might be going wrong, because it's generally not just about behaviours and leadership, it's about your governance strategy and risk frameworks as well, aligning those, and then monitoring the indicators of culture and asking for evidence. So I think finally viewing all matters with a culture lens. Every decision is around what's the impact on people, how people are going to be able to work with these decisions. So that's pretty much it. I really appreciate your comments, Chris. It's been really good having the discussion with you.
I hope I haven't challenged your thinking too much, Georgia. I think we're mostly in agreement, just from a different lens, aren't we? Sorry, Sean.
So we have a few more minutes and a few questions. This one from Michael. I'd be interested in the difference between organisational culture and organisational climate.
Okay, so for me, when we talk about how we operate in an organisation, culture is your internal internal ways of working. Now, for me, climate includes also those external influences on the organisation. So whenever I'm looking at developing strategy within an organisation, we look internally at culture and we look externally at broader things like a pastel analysis that might give us what is the climate that we're operating in, and that actually impacts our decisions around how we need to translate that into the ways of working internally.
Nothing to add, fully agree.
Great. Question from Kirsten. How can a toxic culture be changed through governance when there is a breakdown between staff and the board?
Yeah, it's not going to be changed by governance alone. A toxic culture is really understanding what is the root cause of the toxic culture. Generally, it's a breakdown at a leadership level. It is around leaders who have either ignored and not upheld values-based behaviours or compliance, or have enabled poor behaviours to be created, or a lack of trust. So look, it's not governance alone. Governance will provide the frameworks. Generally, when there's toxic culture being created, there can be really great governance in place, great processes and great policies. It's the failing for me in toxic cultures is at a leadership level.
And this is a question for both of you. A comment, please, around ethics and integrity in relation to culture would be helpful from both presenters. Who wants to go first?
Chris, do you want to go first? I keep going first. So
no problem. Just on the last topic, violently in agreement. I think it comes down to leadership on toxic culture. And what I'd encourage you to do is look at ways that you can report that to the board. You know, there's whistleblower policies, etc. So, okay, ethics and integrity.
In relation to culture.
Yeah. So what I would say to you, in my experience, is that this has to start with the CEO and the leadership team. Ideally, it starts with the board, as Georgia is quite rightly pointing out. But if you don't have integrity and ethics on the roadmap, included in your values and being executed in the ways of working, then generally the symptom will be coming from the leader, in my experience. So I've talked about this a lot in my career. I can only work with what I'm given. And sometimes it feels like lipstick on a pig. It's still a pig, but I can't execute beyond that, you know. So I do genuinely think that starts with the CEO and the leadership team. That's my experience. And if they're built into the ways of working and they're walked and talked, it's because they believe in those two.
Yeah. And I'll say it starts at the board level. To me, I hate seeing integrity as a value. Integrity and respect, they should be your basic way of operating, the basic standard of expectation for our behaviours. What ethics means to you and your organisation needs to be defined at a board level, because there's lots of different ethics depending on the type of organisation that you are and the legislation and frameworks that you are bound by. But integrity and respect should not be a value. They should be your basic standards, and they should be upheld through the whole organisation. Again, it comes down to a leadership thing, but the ethics needs to be the standards of ethics, the way that is interpreted by your organisation and upheld needs to start at a board level.
Fantastic. So we have a whole raft of questions here, which we unfortunately don't have time for because we always like to finish on time. We'll see what we can do with these questions and answers from those a little bit later on. I draw your attention to our webinar schedule between now and the end of the year. We've got a couple of great webinars coming up: Understanding Board Dynamics with Linda Carroll and Steve Bowman. And then on December 6th, going beyond boards, how to open up your strategy process, from an author, a European author who is really excited to be with us on that particular webinar. And last but by no means least, we have our masterclass schedule, how to write better board papers, how to be and think strategic, creating a winning board resume, and how to be a great board chair. You can find all of this detail on our website under our resource center. So just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey if you have time and go into the draw to win our beautiful gift hamper. We'll announce the winner shortly after the session today. Thanks for everybody for your attendance. Thanks to Georgia and Chris for your knowledge and discussion today. It's been fantastic. And I hope you all enjoyed the session today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Georgia. Thanks, Sean.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.